In this talk, first of all, I'm Manoj and I'm a PhD candidate in English from the University of Hyderabad. And I'll be talking about, in this talk, the video game play as it relates to the material imagination, and which forms a part of my research on the video game adaptation of fiction. And I'll be talking about video games and its story worlds and asking the question, how do we imagine in the act of play? And so we begin with the question, what is video game play? And video game play is encompassed within digital play, where we play in engagement with the material medium of the computer and its underlying software, which Miguel Sicart calls the playing with the agency of software. The way Sicart uses agency here is to mean a capacity to act in the world. My reading of the sense of agency is that humans treat the story worlds the software represents and not the software itself as if it has agency. And it is this act of imagination that accords it agency. And it is the sense of treating things in the world as if they have agency is the basis of how I understand what the post-phenomenologist Don Eder says of how humans and technology co-shape each other. So when we play with the agency of the story world's software represents, and the story world is not just what is represented, but also exists in the experiencing and making of it in play. And so if play in general is making coherent the possibilities of acting in the world, like Hendrix has it, then playing is co-shaping the world along with the possibilities and potentialities of the world. Playing in the context of the video game involves co-shaping along with the video game and its story worlds. So keeping these aspects of the video game and the worlds it represents in mind, how do we finally define video game play? Video game play is the experience of the expression of experiencing and making story worlds. So I adapt this definition from Vivian Sobchak's phenomenological description of film as the experience of the expression of experience. Experiencing and making here mean that, like the use of a tool, like a hammer, for example, the video game involves an experiencing and making of something, but also, unlike the hammer, an experience of an aesthetic object as a whole. Therefore, it is an experience of an expression of experiencing and making, where the expression is of both the player and the video game. So the video game expresses its story world through the semiotic modes of text, still and moving image, music, sound effect, and haptics. And the player makes a story world in an agential, embodied, and hermeneutic material engagement with these semiotic modes of expression. So I will come back to this three modes of engagement later. And now we go on to the material imagination of what this means. What does the material imagination mean? So the basis of what I call the experiencing and making involves perception and imagination. And in the intersection of perception and imagination is a way of thinking about creative imagining called the material imagination. As Cocotti and Malaforis say, imagining becomes a process through which the perception of an imaginary object in our mind and the material form that exists or is produced in the world are experienced together. So they give the example of pottery making, and they say that it is not the brain that carries within it on the inside the imaginative act, rather it is the actual engagement with clay that offers the opportunity to imagine. So they challenge the view where imagination is primarily associated with the ability to form and manipulate mental representations in the absence of corresponding visual or other stimuli. As they write, imagination no longer needs to be insulated from the agent's body and the environment. Rather, it is spread out into the world and can now be observed in the wild. So when we play, starting with the agential, hermeneutic, embodied levels of creative engagement, we see the material imagination at work. So when we play, we are imagining a story world in our minds as we are experiencing and making a story world in the video. So to understand this experiencing and making, we need to look at a specific example. So the example I've chosen is an old game, not that old, but Spec Ops, called Spec Ops: The Line, released in 2012 and developed by Jaeger Development. And I will this is a game whose story we all probably know, which is based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Coppola's film Apocalypse Now. And in Spec Ops: The Line, which is set in a post-disaster Dubai, which has been destroyed by a series of sandstorms, the player character's mission as the Delta team, a part of the US Army, is to find survivors. But when we do find them, Captain Martin Walker, who we play as protagonist, insists that the mission must continue to find Conrad, who's spelled with a K, the leader of the 33rd Regiment of the United States Army. Conrad is the Kurtz-like figure of the game who comes to Dubai from a mission in Kabul to lead the evacuation of survivors, which ends in failure. As we move through the sands of Dubai in search of Conrad, we shoot and kill various enemies who obstruct our path. The video game directs our action progressively towards different endings, depending on the choice we make at the end. And the video game and this video game is critical about the excesses of agonistic play in military shooter video games. And the point is that it does not just depict the story world of violence and conflict. Instead, you are experiencing and making the story world in the video game. And if we take David Herman's definition of cognitive narratologist, David Herman, whose definition of story world is is based on the mental representationalist view of cognition, where he says that story worlds are mental models of the situations and events being recounted, of who did what, who, and with whom, where, when, where, why, and in what manner. In this abstract representationalist view, our perception and imagination of story worlds in video games consists of experiencing and making situations and events. It is our experiencing, it is our experience, but rather than looking at it, by looking at it through the material imagination, our perception and imagination of story worlds in video games consists in experiencing and making situations and events. It is our experience of the video game that leads to this understanding. So what the video game teaches us is that the imagination of story worlds in video game play consists in experiencing and making situations and events. So there are three levels of engagement which I want to talk about. The first one is the agential. We play as if the story world has agency. We play as if the software underlying the video game does not exist. We interpret the story world in play as if we are in it. And in the first sense, the agential, story worlds act in certain ways in the video game. It manifests in the video game through the solving of problems. And in Spec Ops: The Line, when we shoot a pane of glass, sand comes rushing through and results in the death of antagonists. In this act of perceiving and shooting a pane of glass and imagining that it will result in the solving the problem is an act of the material imagination. So player and video game co-shape agency through the material imagination. And in the second part of embodiment occurs when technology in its immediacy disappears in our experience of the world it represents. And immediacy is a style of visual representation whose goal is to make the viewer forget the presence of the medium and believe that he is in the presence of the objects of representation. This is an artistic expression of the video game. Video game play involves playing as if there is no software underlying our experience of the world it represents. And in Spec Ops: The Line, through the first player perspective, the player embodies the character and the gun. And the player and the video game co-shape embodiment, the material imagination. And in the third sense, the hermeneutic sense, that hermeneutics has always been concerned with the relation of the part to the whole and the whole to the part. And we have with Olia Corina's description of the hermeneutic lemon scale, a fairly sophisticated description of human technology relations. And here it is presented as it is summarized by Peter Paul Verbeek. And he writes, the technologically mediated hermeneutic circle connects human technology and world via a lemon scale with the shape of the infinity symbol. Humans interpret the technology, the first process, and then the which then mediates human interpretations of the world, the second process. And then within the specific understanding of the world, the technology acquires a specific role and meaning, the third process, the world to technology, and then constitutes the user in a specific way, the last one, technology to human. Although this hermeneutic formula works for what Corina describes for the ultrasound, it does not work in the same way for the video game. The technological mediation of the video game, therefore, needs to be adapted to this understanding of the hermeneutic lemon scale. The player plays a video game, and which technologically mediates the making of a story world. The story world relates to the material world in particular ways, and the material world shapes our understanding of the video game, which then constitutes the player in particular ways. So in Spec Ops: The Line, the player plays a video game which relates to the post 9/11 US interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also to its relation to the historical atrocities depicted in Conrad's and Coppola's texts. So this realization shapes the video game, which constitutes the player in particular ways. So through this understanding, we can claim that when the player interprets the video game as if they are present in it, the player and the video game co-shape the interpretation through the material imagination. What underlies the co-shaping of agency, embodiment, and hermeneutics is the imagined materiality of the story world. So, and with this, I'd like to conclude saying that there is an identification in the material imagination then of what we engage with through agency, what is being done through embodiment, and what this doing represents through hermeneutics. And the it is in a creative engagement with the imagined materiality of the story world that we shape the material form of the video game existence. The material imagination allows us to understand how the player reaches out to the video game and the world it represents. So with this talk, which was quite different from the ones which were presented before, is from a reception perspective. But I hope that this perspective of reception will also inform a certain kind of thinking about design. And I would love to hear questions, or if you have any. Yeah.
I have a question. I can start. First of all, this is just super interesting. I think the conception of games as like playing games as a fundamentally creative act is really interesting. Just kind of a thought that I had as I was listening to your talk is it would be interesting to consider how multiplayer games factor in here, and kind of my own experiential perspective on that is I think the imagination and the creativity kind of compounds when you're playing with other people. In my past experience and also in people that I've seen, like people almost make their own like mythologies about what happened in games and what they did in games when they were playing with other people. So I think that's a really interesting thing to consider. And then my question is about kind of related to what Jenny was talking about a few talks back. She mentioned kind of prescribed gameplay versus more open-ended gameplay. And I think your perspective here is interesting because an implication that I was getting from it is that the act of creativity happens for the player no matter how prescribed the story of the gameplay is. But I was curious to hear like your perspective on that, and do you think games should be more open to kind of enable this creative act, or can it also happen in a powerful way in more prescribed directed games?
Yeah, so there was a perspective about games which was popular in the late 2000s, which was called procedurality, which assumed that you the player embodies a certain procedure in the game, through which enacts a certain ideology. So let's say you take the position of let's say any important figure in the game. Let's say a Democrat in a game. I mean, so you assume the position of that figure and you play through that. But instead, what critics of this view suggest that the playing doesn't happen in this prescriptive sense. That it happens beyond that. It happens through that. So when you imagine playing someone, a political figure or anyone, you don't embody their ideologies through the procedural rules of the game. Rather, you play through them, against them. You try to find the limits of what you can do in this world. So I think that is my way of thinking about this sense of prescriptivism versus a descriptive sense of play.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Manoj. It was fantastic. I think we all learned a lot. I'd like to ask about the extent to which we can truly imagine the material substratum or when I say the programmatic infrastructure of our video games. So I think that any good video game would be one in which you forget that you're playing a game and you become immersed into it. So for instance, if you're playing Super Mario Brothers, you want to forget that you're sort of touching the control pad and sort of imagine you're running along and jumping over the turtles.
Yeah.
But instead, in all the games, there's a limit to the extent to which we can sort of escape from our sort of our from our unilateral direction of it, or alternatively, that we can disassociate ourselves from a recognition that there is an underlying program that is scripting the operations. And so, is this material imagination always a kind of approach to the material as though it were a kind of vanishing extension, or kind of is this always like we're approaching a mirage, whereby we can only continue to see and feel the expectation of the mirage insofar as we have not yet come to it, and as soon as it were we come close enough to it, it vanishes. So at what point does, as it were, the material co-imagination you're describing sort of disappear? And is that a bug in the system, or is that something that we should just anticipate, and should a good game sort of allow us to recognize the irony that we can't really escape from the fact that it is a simulation and that we're always sort of imagining it at a distance from its material base?
Yeah, so the correlate to the immediacy which I talked about is the hypermediacy, which you are conscious of the medium with which you're playing. And that also becomes a part of the way in which you play the game sometimes, because the game reminds you that you have to press these buttons. And so the actual is always correlated to the virtual, and the actual always plays into the virtual. Because when you begin playing any game, it begins with that press this to move forward. And so the pressing of the buttons is related to the virtual. And so when I look into a world of the game, I am like, let's say I'm holding a phone and I'm peering into it. I'm not, I mean, it's not like virtual reality where you're actually in it and the experience is, there is no screen. But the point with the video game is that it is always, this materiality is always, it is always being co-shaped by the actual, and it is always between the actual and the virtual.
Thank you.